So how to translate these processes into design principles? So often the strategy is that we mimic natural systems. So actually that is the essence of permaculture and agroecology. And we can mimic the composition, like species composition, the dominance, which culture is more dominant in the system, spatial arrangement, and also age structures. As an example, one strategy is also one strategy is additive design. When we add species, our cultivated species, into existing natural or semi-natural system. For example, we can grow ginseng in forest farming, системі лісового фермерства. Another approach is substitutive design or design заміщенням, where we detect the functions, agroecological, or let's say ecological functions of each member of natural communities, and we try to substitute it with the crops having similar functions. And of course, there is an intermediate options where we combine these two. Again, I need to stress here that we place a main component in this mimicry approach on functional characteristics of species rather than on their species identity. So this is basically mimicry hypothesis or mimicry approach, when we mimic the structure and processes of natural system and let the system develop further and increase its diversity. So we should mimic both the structure and function of natural systems, and we also need to mimic the dynamic of natural succession or development of plant communities, development and change of plant communities. You may hear or know that there are two major groups of plants in terms of their place in ecological succession. It's so-called R-type plants or ruderals. In Ukrainian, it's the same ruderale, which colonize the system during its growing state phase, like from the phase of disruption to restoration. And these are usually annuals, fast growings, and they are adapted to this disturbed environment. And later on, they are changed to so-called K-type plants, which are more adapted to competitive environments with more scarce resources. And we can utilize this approach in a way that our cover crops is usually actually these R-type plants or ruderals, where we plant them in disturbed system, for example, after tillage or after harvesting. And these characteristics, which I listed to you earlier, are specific for crops of family Brassicaceae or Crotalaria. And basically, these plants are often used as cover crops, which are programmed to produce high biomass and then die quickly. And this way they establish the cover to protect our ground between two crops. We often assess the performance of polycultures using the land equivalent ratio or коефіцієнт ефективності землекористування. which means that our system with 2 or more crops can produce more biomass or more yield than any of this monoculture system. And this situation is called over-yielding. And that is the situation which we try to get in our polycultures, that they just don't produce the same yield as they would be in monocultures, but higher yield, that there is actually some positive interactions between these two crops. And again, the one of the mechanism of this over-yielding is competition avoidance. As you can see, for example, here in these 3 sister polycultures, so each component use different strata or layer of above ground space, but also different layers of below ground space. So actually modeling of the root system in these 3 sisters polyculture demonstrated that when these crops cultivated together, they have higher nitrogen uptake, but the phosphorus uptake does not benefit from this combination, which means that even in such well-known and historic and super established polyculture system, there is still a room for improvement. And it might seem that most beneficial or like typical, obviously beneficial situation is combination of nitrogen fixing with not nitrogen fixing crops. But here is an research where they did a meta-analysis of over-yielding polyculture combination, and they demonstrated that in quite a majority of this combination, the role plays mobilization of phosphorus or micronutrients such as iron, zinc, or manganese by one of the polyculture components. So even you can get this over-yielding situation in the cropping system which does not have leguminous crops. But I don't suggest you to design the systems without leguminous crops. And actually, this is one way how you can design polyculture on this 3 sister system. So you basically can replace each component of these 3 sisters with functionally similar crops. So, for example, okra can stands for maize for providing structural support to bean. Peanut or cowpea can replace bean as nitrogen fixers, and instead of pumpkin, you can use watermelon. So you can play and explore this situation. But as for these particular examples, which I demonstrated to you, that it's only watermelon and okra get benefit in this system because they were the most competitive crops, and also the performance of this combination depended on environmental conditions, in particular on precipitation or droughts. So there are a full gradation of multi-species cropping systems with different level of species number, spatial and temporal diversity and complexity. And also different systems have different efficiency in provisioning particular or various agroecosystem services. So now let's consider different strategies for combining crops in space and time. So first situation, which we often refer as polyculture, is simultaneous intercropping, о ущільнені посадки або одночасне змішування культур, where we mix species or varieties together. So we just mix seeds and plant them all together, which means that there is no competition between these crops. They grow together, they help each other, like everything is perfect. One constraint in this system is, of course, the management complexity, because you need somehow to separate the yield, the products of these crops. And for example, in case of cereal legume systems, there are special devices, maybe you can later on share if any one of you used it, which allow you to separate the grains of cereals and legumes based on their size. So it's important when you design the system, if you have this equipment in your community, that the size of grains is different. The second is temporal intercropping, or тимчасове змішування культур, where you combine so together fast growing crops and the slow growing crops. So fast growing crops is harvested and it gives the room for development of the slow growing crops. And as I already mentioned to you, for that combination, you need your slow growing crops to tolerate shading and to develop slowly during the initial growing stage. The third strategy is relay cropping, or змішані ущільнені посадки або естафетне вирощування. When you plant the second crop during the growth of the first crop. So basically in the stand of the first crops, usually this situation occur next to the close to the harvesting point, where the shoots become too dry and they let more air in and they already doesn't consume that much of resources, that you plant the second crop. Actually, a permaculturist might be well familiar with this system by the work of Masanobu Fukuoka, who heavily use this. And this is basically the strategy to avoid competition between two crops. Another combination is double cropping, або два врожаї на рік, where you basically during one season you harvest one crop and then you plant the second crops. Of course, you need to plan in a way that you can still fit both of these crops within the vegetation period of your zone, climate zone. And finally, crop rotation, where you plant crops one by one. This is actually one of the most efficient strategy for controlling weeds in organic agriculture, especially when you combine summer and winter crops, ярі та озимі культури, and within these groups, when you combine crops with different sowing dates, because of the variety of farming operations, you can destroy both early and late weeds just by combining these planting dates. Also in this system, important thing that some processes you can regulate at the individual crop level, some processes at rotation level. So for example, as for pest and weed control, you need to know not only the previous crop, but previous crop before that, and the same as for the tillage operation, because this legacy can like efficiently last at least for two generations. So actually here you can see this example of a relay cropping system, and here you can see that the tall crop quite efficiently protect the ground and hence the lower crop from the frost. And actually, you can use it now because of we can benefit from the global warming, because now we have like really a long autumn, warm autumn, and with a lot of rain. And of course, it can damage our soil and cause erosion, but also it's an opportunity for us to like really grow some cover crop and winter crop and produce a high biomass before the frosts. Okay, I just start of the slideshow here. So now we reviewed all the cropping systems for combining annual cultures. Here are the cropping system for combining annual and perennial cultures. So one obvious system is early cropping, where you plant your herbaceous crops in between the rows of trees. If you really want to get a good yield of your early crops, herbaceous early crops, you need to provide sufficient spacing between the tree rows, meaning that you need to plant less trees per unit area if you or the farmer you consult is agree for that trade-off, that he has less one product but more product in total. The second is or so actually like maybe it's also like the mix. Some systems can be used as for growing annuals, some for growing both annuals and perennials. So this is still used for growing annuals, is row cropping. It's in Ukrainian через рядкове суміщення культур. It's despite the first situation, which is simultaneous intercropping, you plant different crops in separate rows, and still you give plenty of rooms for opportunities for different crops to interact, establish beneficial interaction, but also the system is easier to manage. It's often used in vegetable growing. Another strategy is strip intercropping, where it's not rows, individual rows, intermingled rows, but strips через рядкове суміщення культур. Here we need to account for two processes. First process is efficient distance of interaction, відстань ефективної взаємодії. So the processes, especially the nutrient cycling processes, of course, they can spread up to the certain distance. A good example of that is growing strips of wheat with the strips of maize. And you had a better grow of maize at the border, because here the maize border rows of maize, of the strip of maize plants, receive more light. This is actually border effect. And one very interesting system is called checkboard intercropping, або суміщення за принципом шахівниці. This is very interesting. Actually, if we have anyone from my institute, ZALF, they can recall one experiment that we have here. And it's a good way to increase diversity to quite high extent, but it's also very interesting for agroforestry situation. If as like comparing to early cropping, if you grow like something like really super precious tree crop, for example, almonds, and you don't want to get higher rows, you still can get diversity in your system by creating blocks of young trees and adult or mature trees. In young trees, before they start to fruit, you can still grow some crop or some cash crop or cover crops in alleys, and this way, for example, at least you can provide some resources for pollinators. Also, like for the two last system, actually like for three system, early cropping, strip cropping, and checkboard intercropping, you design your system taking into consideration the width of your tools or agricultural machinery. So this system are compatible with the agricultural machinery. And now I hope that we still have time. Steffi, how much time do we have? Oh, not Elisa, sorry.
We have another 20 minutes.
20 minutes, perfect.
Yes.
Then you have some small time to play with the Polyculture design tool that we developed. So this tool is was designed for developing polycultures of vegetables and spice and aromatic crops. So basically you start from defining your cash crops, and the system offer you known companions. Then you go through reviewing the traits of these crops linked to variety of agroecosystem services, and we collected these traits from 3 different databases. Finally, you can so you start with whatever crops you want to grow, despite that they have different management requirements or different soil requirements. You just list all crops, and at the later stage you can group your crops into so-called zones for with different soil and moisture conditions. Later on, you can add spice and aromatic crops into this system, in particular to ensure pest control. I did a systematic literature review of publications on these crops, and you can even, in some situation, you can even specify the weed or pest of your particular concern, and the system offers you the list of spice and aromatic crops which could potentially solve this problem. And at the end, um, you can increase complementarity in your system. All your selected crops for each zone will be listed, and the traits will be listed, so you can just add some additional crops to have complementary root traits, or to enable facilitation. For example, if you have mycorrhizal crops, you can add more mycorrhizal crops. So basically now I post you in chat the link to this tool, and you will be automatically reassigned into 5 or how much do we have? I guess 7 breakout rooms where you can in group practice this tool. And I will be moving between the groups to guide you. You don't need, of course, to come up to the 10th spreadsheet. It takes time. Even it's fine if you stay with the first spreadsheet, which where you specify your crops, and the system propose you like possible associates. And then I think that we have a break. I think that I propose this the next setting.
Pablo,
Yeah,
we have
I saw the question, but I really would like people to have an opportunity to explore this tool. So I propose the next arrangement, that I start this breakout rooms, and whoever have questions, they just stay in the main room and I can answer these questions, and all participants can see the answer on recorded in recording. So now I start the breakout rooms and will answer the questions in the main room. The link to the Polyculture tool is in the chat, and I would like to draw your attention that we have actually we have 5 or maybe Sebastian, if you could help me, because we have only 5 copies of this tool. If you can just assign people more or less similar to 5 rooms, and then while I'm answering these questions, and then we can start this room so that each group can work with their version of this tool. So basically, as you will see on the first slide that like zero default is one copy number 1, and then there is copy number 2, 3, and 4, and so on. So okay, Sebastian?
Yes, I will do this.
Okay, so now I'm answering the question. Okay, so the question was, what is the diversification practices for grape cultivation, and which cultures are combined with the grape? I think that I would rather forward this question to the audience, because I'm not expert in this particular system. But what I can say, that for the grape system, there is very well developed system of crop livestock integration, where you grow cover crops in alleys of the grape, and you let sheep graze this cover crop, and hence enable fast residues mineralization. Even more, this sheep, they will pluck the lower leaves of grape, and this operation is necessary for grape ripening. Otherwise, you need to hire human workers, and it will be much more expensive. My colleagues from the University of California, Davis, they give a lot of webinars about these topics. If you are interested, you can later on contact me privately. I connect you with these people. They organize a lot of farm schools with a lot of practical information. Yes, and you can learn about that. If someone knows about some polyculture systems, you can like in terms of other commercial crop for a grape, you can add here.